Imagine being so disgustingly overweight that even your own royal family struggles to look after you. Well, sadly, this was a reality for England's fattest king, the infamous George IV. But how did he die? What were his very last moments like? And what did doctors find when they carried out his autopsy? Well, today we're answering just that. George IV came to power in 1796 and immediately set about living the high life. He became known as the Prince of Pleasure, a man whose charm, extravagance, and larger-than-life personality became a symbol of the excesses of the Georgian era. However, beneath the surface of this charismatic ruler lay a ticking time bomb of his own making. You see, from a young age, George had developed a taste for the finer things in life: food, drink, gambling, and smoking. It was a habit he never gave up. Instead, it soon became clear that these indulgences were spiraling out of control. George ate himself into a grotesque caricature of his former self, his face and body becoming a fleshy mask of gluttony. His unhealthy habits didn't just make him morbidly obese, but they also had a devastating effect on his health. By the time he was in his late 20s, he weighed nearly 300 pounds. This made simple tasks like walking incredibly difficult. As the years went on, the king's weight continued to increase. Soon his clothes no longer fit him, and he had to have new ones made to accommodate his massive frame. It got to the point where he was so heavy that he could barely move. He couldn't walk unaided and had to be moved around in a special chair designed to support his enormous bulk. Those who saw the king during these final years said that he looked like nothing, so much as a bloated corpse. His skin was stretched so taut over his body that it was shiny and almost translucent. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now looked dull and lifeless, like those of a dead fish. The king's suffering wasn't just physical. He was also mentally and emotionally drained. Gout, a painful form of arthritis, took hold of his limbs, particularly his beloved feet. In addition to this, he suffered from dropsy, a condition that causes the body to swell with fluid. So the king was in agony. But it was more than that. He was trapped inside his own body, unable to move or speak freely because of the sheer size of his frame. For someone who had once been so vibrant and full of energy, this must have been an incredibly frustrating and lonely experience. Even the most basic tasks, like eating or drinking, became Herculean efforts. The king would lie in bed for hours on end, unable to move, while his servants tried to feed him. Often the king would simply give up on eating because the effort required was just too great. There were times when the king would become so frustrated that he would lash out at his attendants, screaming obscenities and cursing his fate. Yet despite all this, there was always hope that he would pull through. After all, he was the King of England. He had access to the finest doctors and the latest medical treatments. However, this proved to be a false hope, because as the king's condition worsened, it became clear that nothing could save him. No medicine, no surgery, not even the royal physician's best efforts could stop the relentless march of disease. In the end, it was the king's own excesses that brought him down. His gluttony and his addiction to rich foods and sedentary lifestyle had taken a terrible toll on his body. When the end finally came, it was a relief for the king, if only because it meant that his endless suffering would finally come to an end. As he slipped away from this world, he left behind a legacy of excess and debauchery that would become the stuff of legend. But this is where things get really gruesome. Underneath the layers of fat and flesh, the king's body was a horrifying mess. When the doctors performed the autopsy, they found a litany of ailments that were the result of the king's unhealthy lifestyle. His heart was unusually small, a condition that can cause a number of other problems, such as high blood pressure and stroke. In addition to this, the king had a number of other serious health issues, including chronic bronchitis, which can cause coughing fits and difficulty breathing. These conditions would have made it hard for the king to exercise and would have contributed to his overall weakness. And then there were the less visible signs of the king's unhealthy lifestyle. When the doctors examined his internal organs, they found that they were coated in a thick layer of fat. This isn't necessarily a sign of bad health, but it does indicate that the king was carrying a lot of extra body weight, which we know he was. What's more, the king's blood vessels were clogged with cholesterol, which can lead to heart disease and stroke. All of these conditions would have made it difficult for the king to carry out his daily duties. But he was determined to soldier on. Despite his ill health, the king was determined to keep up the appearance of being a strong and healthy monarch. He continued to ride his horses, hunt, and attend parties. But this was a losing battle. As his body grew weaker, it became clear that he wouldn't be able to carry on in this way forever. In the end, it was his own body that won the battle. The king's health deteriorated rapidly, and he died on June 26, 1830. When news of the king's death reached the public, there was a mixed reaction. On the one hand, he was a popular figure who had done much to promote the arts and culture. On the other hand, he was seen as a symbol of the excesses of the ruling class. Some people celebrated his death, believing that it was the end of an era. Others mourned the loss of a man who had been both a father and a brother. Ultimately, though, the king's death was seen as a necessary evil. He had been ill for so long that it was clear that he couldn't carry on as monarch. The new king, William IV, was seen as a breath of fresh air, and the country moved on. However, as time went on, people began to forget the bad and remember the good times. Today, George IV is remembered as a great patron of the arts and a man who helped to shape the course of English history. His death, however, is still seen as a tragedy. It was the death of a man who had so much potential, but who threw it all away because of his own excesses. To this day, people are fascinated by the story of George IV and his terrifying final days. It's a cautionary tale of what happens when someone lives a life of excess. But it's also a story of a man who was ultimately doomed by his own body. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the next one for more gruesome historical tales. Don't forget to subscribe.